Richard, listen to me very carefully. Cancel every bank card you have, change the combination to your safe today, and no matter what happens, do not go back home tonight. Gary Evans said those words in the small room behind his repair shop, where the pale blue glow from 3 computer monitors washed across a face so drained of color that I barely recognized the friend I had known for more than 30 years. Gary had never been the kind of man who panicked easily. I had seen him deal with data breaches that cost business owners millions of dollars, and I had watched him sit across from federal investigators for hours without raising his voice. Yet that afternoon, both of his hands were visibly trembling against the edge of his desk, and he could not stop looking at the lines of data on the screen. My name is Richard Stanton. I was 70 years old that year, and I had spent nearly 5 decades building a logistics and warehousing company in Texas from almost nothing. When I started, all I had was an old truck, a small rented warehouse outside Austin, and a bank loan large enough to keep me awake for years. I drove deliveries myself, found my own customers, counted inventory by hand, and there were months when my wife Martha and I sat at the kitchen table, trying to decide whether we should pay our employees first or make the mortgage payment on our house. Those years taught me something important. When everyone around you begins to panic, that is usually the moment when you need to pay closer attention. I had lived through recessions, competitors trying to undercut my company, and deals that could have destroyed the entire business with one bad decision. Over time, I learned to stay calm before acting, even when every instinct inside me wanted to do the opposite. One warehouse became 3. 3 became a transportation network, then distribution centers and industrial properties positioned along major commercial routes throughout Texas. By the time I reached my 60s, I no longer had to drive trucks or count pallets myself. The company employed hundreds of people, and my family's assets had grown into the tens of millions of dollars. People sometimes called me a logistics tycoon, but I never thought of myself that way. To me, everything I owned was simply the result of nearly half a century of work, and the sacrifices Martha and I had made to keep the company alive during the years. When failure was always only a few bad months away, after Martha died, money stopped mattering as much as it once had. The house we had shared suddenly felt far too large, and although I could afford nearly anything I wanted, there was no amount of money that could bring back the sound of her footsteps in the hallway or the familiar voice that had greeted me at the end of every day. That was why I wanted to be closer to Derek, my only son. Derek was different from me. He was not hard-edged or aggressive, and he did not approach every negotiation as a contest of wills. But he was intelligent, patient, and trusted by the people who worked for him. After years inside the family company, Derek gradually took over most of the daily operations, while I retained control over major investments and important assets. I trusted my son, and for many years, I also trusted the woman he had married. Natalie ran a high-end event planning company in Austin. She knew how to deal with wealthy clients, when to listen, when to smile, and how to remain composed even when an entire event seemed to be falling apart around her. For years, I considered that ability a strength and even thought Derek was fortunate to have such a capable woman beside him. After I retired, I moved in with them at a $3 million mansion in Westlake Hills. The house sat on a hillside overlooking Austin, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, marble floors, and a large backyard. When Derek and Natalie bought the property, I paid nearly 80% of the down payment because I wanted my son to have an easier life than the one Martha and I had struggled to build. Everything began on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning. I came downstairs a little after 7 and found Derek sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had barely touched. It took only a few seconds for me to realize how much worse he looked than he had before. His cheeks were hollow, his skin was pale, dark circles surrounded his eyes, and the shirt that had once fit him properly now hung loosely around his shoulders. I sat across from him and asked whether he had been sleeping. Derek looked up slowly, almost as if he needed several seconds to process the question, then admitted that his mind had felt foggy lately. Sometimes he had to read an email several times before understanding it. I told him he should see a doctor, but he only rubbed his forehead and said Natalie thought it was probably stress from work. I was about to ask more when I heard Natalie speaking in the living room. She was on the phone, talking so quietly that she was almost whispering, and the tension in her voice immediately caught my attention. Natalie could normally deal with an angry client or a disastrous event without losing her composure, but that morning she was speaking quickly and pausing repeatedly, as though someone on the other end was putting pressure on her. I caught only fragments, things like, "It can't happen any faster," and "He's here right now." At that moment, my foot accidentally struck a wooden chair beside the table, dragging one leg sharply across the marble floor. Natalie jumped so violently that the phone slipped from her hand, struck the marble, and shattered its screen. She immediately bent down to pick it up, pressing the power button again and again with a level of panic I had never seen her show over an electronic device. When I asked whether the phone contained something important, Natalie looked up at me, and for one brief moment, I saw genuine fear in her eyes before it disappeared behind her usual calm expression. She explained that the device contained contracts, event schedules, and client information that had not been backed up. I immediately thought of Gary Evans. Gary had worked in cybersecurity and digital investigations before retiring. Later, he opened a small computer repair shop, mostly to keep himself occupied, but his ability to recover damaged data was still far beyond what an ordinary repair shop could offer. I suggested taking the phone to Gary, but Natalie rejected the idea almost immediately. Her answer came so quickly that it caught my attention, and although she immediately corrected herself by saying she simply did not want to inconvenience me, the urgency of her reaction stayed with me. I told her Gary's shop was only 15 minutes away and held out my hand. Natalie stood there for several seconds, looking at the phone and then at me before reluctantly placing it in my palm. She asked me to recover only the files related to her clients. At the time, I still did not understand why she had hesitated. Later, I realized that was the moment Natalie understood that the most dangerous secrets in her life had just left the house with me. I reached Gary's shop shortly before 9. He examined the phone and said the recovery could take an hour or two, so I sat in the front waiting area, reading the newspaper while he worked in the back room. Nearly 2 hours passed before Gary called my name. The way he said Richard was enough to make me put the newspaper down immediately because his voice sounded completely different from when I had arrived. I entered the room in the back and watched Gary close the door, lock it, and pull the blinds. His face had gone pale, and the computer monitor in front of him was filled with folders recovered from Natalie's phone. I asked what had happened, but Gary did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked whether Natalie was currently living in the same house as Derek and me. Then he asked a question that made me frown. "Do you regularly eat or drink things she prepares for you?" I had no idea what that had to do with the phone, but rather than explaining, Gary turned the monitor toward me. A conversation from a hidden application appeared on the screen. The contact had no name, only a gray icon. The first message said they could not wait another month and that Natalie needed to finish the guardianship paperwork that week. Natalie replied that she was trying, but Derek kept delaying. The other person asked about the old man. Natalie answered that I had started asking about the $200,000 withdrawn on Monday. I looked at Gary because 3 days earlier, I really had discovered that $200,000 had disappeared from one of my investment accounts. I had asked Derek about it, and he said he would look into the matter, but afterward, I never followed up because I assumed I had forgotten. Gary scrolled farther down. The next message turned everything inside me cold. The unknown contact told Natalie not to let me examine the accounts and instructed her to increase the dosage in my morning drink so that the old man loses his mind faster. If I asked about the money again, She was supposed to double the number of drops. I stared at those words for a long time. The trembling hands, the mental fog, the gaps in my memory, all suddenly carried a completely different meaning. Then I thought about Derek, his pale face, his shrinking body, the way he sat in front of a computer and struggled to focus. I asked Gary whether there were any messages about my son. He remained silent for several seconds before opening another conversation in which Natalie complained that Derek was still resisting signing documents. The response told her to keep giving it to him because Derek did not need to understand anything. He only needed to sign. Another message said that when everything was over, financial records would make Derek look like the person who had approved the suspicious transactions. That was when I understood. My son was not her accomplice. He was being poisoned too. Gary wanted to call the police immediately, but I stopped him. If Natalie had spent months constructing a story that I was suffering cognitive decline, confronting her too soon could make me look like exactly what she wanted everyone to see. A paranoid old man whose judgment could no longer be trusted. I needed to understand the entire plan before acting. I needed to know who the other person was, how much money they had taken, and most importantly, how to get Derek out without putting him in even greater danger. Gary stared at me for a long time and told me not to return home. I understood his fear, but if I disappeared immediately after bringing Natalie's phone to him, she would know we had discovered something. So I had to go back. Before I left, Gary copied the recovered data onto several separate devices and made me change the passwords on my most important accounts. At the door, he grabbed my arm and reminded me that this was no longer merely a financial dispute. Anyone willing to put drugs into another person's drink might be capable of much worse if they discovered they had been exposed. I told him I understood. When I returned to the house in Westlake Hills, Natalie was standing in the kitchen and immediately asked about her phone. I told her Gary needed another day to complete the recovery, then deliberately allowed my eyes to lose focus as if I were exhausted. Natalie asked whether I was feeling all right. I slowly told her that my mind felt a little foggy that day. Immediately, I saw a completely genuine emotion appear on her face. It was not concern, it was relief. In that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do. If Natalie wanted an old man who was losing his mind, I would give her exactly that. Only this time, I would be the one watching her. I barely slept the first night after reading those messages. I lay in my room going back over memories from the previous months, and the more I thought about them, the more I realized how many incidents I had dismissed, as normal signs of aging now seemed suspicious. There had been a day when I drove toward the bank and halfway there could no longer remember why I was going. Another time, I opened my safe and stood in front of it for nearly a minute because I could not remember what document I had intended to retrieve. I had missed phone calls, confused meeting dates, and experienced mornings when my hands trembled badly enough that I had to put down my coffee. Natalie had always been there to explain. She said I was working too much, said age was finally catching up with me, and even suggested that losing Martha might have affected my mental sharpness. At the time, those explanations sounded reasonable because they came from someone inside my family and were always delivered in a caring voice. Now I understood she had not merely been explaining my symptoms. She had been building a narrative around them. I started thinking about the green smoothies Natalie prepared every morning. She always said they were good for my heart, increased energy, and supported memory. At first I drank them because I did not want to argue, and eventually they became part of my routine. What I had never noticed before was how carefully Natalie made sure both Derek and I finished them. If I left early, she poured mine into a travel bottle. If Derek said he did not want his, Natalie reminded him that he needed to take better care of himself. Those gestures had once looked like concern. Now they made my skin crawl. The following morning, I went downstairs at the usual time. A smoothie was already sitting in front of my place. Natalie asked why I did not drink it immediately. I said my stomach felt unsettled. but she quickly told me the smoothie would probably make me feel better. I raised the glass to my mouth without drinking. When Natalie turned toward the coffee machine, I pretended to spill some on a napkin, then carried the glass back to my room, saying I wanted to drink it while reading the paper. Once the door was closed, I poured everything down the sink. About an hour later, I realized my mind felt clearer than it had on many recent mornings. It was not proof, but it was enough to convince me that Gary had not overreacted. Derek came downstairs later. Natalie handed him an identical glass. I watched my son drink almost all of it within minutes and had to restrain myself from walking over and knocking it out of his hand. The problem was that I still did not know what Natalie was using or how dependent Derek's body might already have become. If I acted too early, I could make the situation more dangerous. So I watched. Over the next several days, I recorded the time Derek drank his smoothie and what happened afterward. Almost every time, 30 to 40 minutes after breakfast, his reactions became noticeably slower. His eyes grew heavy, his speech became less certain, and his ability to concentrate declined. What disturbed me even more was that Natalie usually chose that exact period to bring documents to him. One morning, I stood in the hallway and watched her place a stack of papers in front of Derek. He asked what they were, and Natalie said they were simply company contracts that had to be signed before noon. Derek opened the first page and tried to read, but after only a few lines he rubbed his temples. Natalie immediately told him she had already reviewed everything, and that he only needed to sign where she had marked the pages. Derek trusted his wife. He picked up the pen and signed each document. Watching from a distance, I finally understood why so many suspicious transactions carried my son's name. Natalie did not need Derek to understand what he was doing. She only needed him conscious enough to hold a pen. That evening, I decided to test their reactions over dinner. Natalie had made salmon. Derek looked more exhausted than usual, and I waited until everyone was seated before asking about the $200,000 withdrawn on Monday. Derek looked confused. Natalie did not. She calmly placed her knife down and asked whether I had forgotten again. I asked what I was supposed to have forgotten. Natalie explained that I had agreed to let Derek use the money for a real estate investment. When I turned to my son, he nodded and said I had signed a power of attorney the previous Thursday. I knew I had signed nothing. Instead of arguing, I pretended to search my memory. Natalie immediately mentioned a doctor named Eris and said he had warned that after my medication adjustment, I might experience gaps in memory. I had never met any Dr. Eris. I had never taken the medication she was talking about either. But Derek believed her. He looked at me with concern and gently said my memory had genuinely seemed worse lately. That moment hurt more than anything I had read on the phone. Not because my son doubted me, but because I realized Natalie had pulled him so deeply into her false reality that he was unknowingly helping reinforce her lies. I lowered my head and said, perhaps I really had forgotten. Natalie placed her hand over mine and said everything would be fine because family was there to help me. It took everything I had not to pull my hand away. Close to midnight, I noticed light coming from Derek's office and went downstairs. He was sitting in front of the computer in darkness, staring at a spreadsheet without doing much of anything. I had to call his name twice before he turned around. Derek admitted that something felt wrong. Sometimes he woke up without clearly remembering what he had done the previous evening, and sometimes he could not focus long enough to finish a simple document. He said Natalie believed it was stress. I sat beside my son and studied his exhausted face. At that point, I no longer had any doubt. Derek was not her partner. He was a prisoner Natalie was weakening day by day, so she could use his name, his signature, and his access. I wanted to tell him everything at that moment, but I still had to remain silent. If Derek panicked and confronted Natalie, the entire plan could be exposed before we knew what substance she was giving him, who was behind her, or how extensive the financial transactions had become. I simply told my son to get some sleep. After Derek left, I went into my private office and checked the safe. The moment I opened it, I knew somebody had been inside. The fingerprint sensor had been wiped so clean that almost no trace remained, and several bank statements were missing. I checked my online accounts and discovered that my mailing address had been changed to a private mailbox, registered in Natalie's name. I sat in the darkness for a long time. A war was taking place inside my own home. For months, I had not even realized I was living on the battlefield. The next morning, I began documenting everything on paper, rather than storing it on a computer. Dates, times, drinks, changes in Derek's behavior, documents Natalie handed him, suspicious transactions, and statements she made. I no longer trusted any electronic device in the house. If Natalie had access to my accounts and could alter banking information, I had no way of knowing what else she might control. Gary continued examining the recovered phone data. He told me the hidden contact used several different numbers and seemed to have substantial knowledge of law, finance, and guardianship procedures. That told me we were not dealing with an impulsive scheme. Somebody had prepared carefully. I began deliberately appearing more impaired in front of Natalie. Once, I asked Derek the same question about a meeting twice. Another time, I left my car keys in the refrigerator. One morning, I even looked directly at Natalie and called her Martha. She froze at the sound of my dead wife's name. I immediately apologized, rubbed my forehead, and said my mind seemed to be getting worse. Natalie walked over, put a hand on my shoulder, and told me not to worry because she and Derek would take care of me. But in her eyes, I saw something else, satisfaction. From that point on, she became less careful. She spoke on the phone while I was nearby, carried documents around without locking them away, and sometimes discussed my accounts in the living room as though I were no longer capable of understanding. My disguise was working. The weaker I appeared, the more I could see. What finally showed me the true scale of Natalie's plan was not another message or a larger missing transaction. It was an envelope I retrieved from the mailbox before she could check it. My name was printed on the front. The sender was the court. I took the envelope to my car and opened it. Inside were documents related to a petition for mandatory guardianship. I read every page. Natalie described me as an elderly man experiencing rapid cognitive decline, regularly forgetting financial decisions, and at risk of damaging my own assets if I remained in full control of them. She listed very specific incidents. The $200,000 I had supposedly forgotten approving, the power of attorney I had supposedly forgotten signing, the appointment with Dr. Aris that I could not remember. There were even notes about my confusion over dates, misplaced keys, and calling Natalie by the wrong name. I had to sit quietly for several minutes after reading it. The false symptoms I had deliberately begun performing to fool her were now being inserted directly into a legal case. That was dangerous, but it also gave me an advantage. Natalie believed her plan was working faster than expected. If the court approved the petition, I could lose control of my bank accounts, property, medical decisions, and even where I was allowed to live. She did not merely intend to steal part of my money. She wanted control over my life. I photographed every page and then returned the envelope to exactly where it had been. That night, I went to bed early and pretended to sleep. At around 2 in the morning, my bedroom door opened softly. I kept my breathing steady. I smelled Natalie's familiar perfume before she reached the bed. She stood there for several seconds before gently lifting my right hand. I understood what she intended as soon as she moved my index finger toward the tablet on my nightstand. The device unlocked with a fingerprint. Natalie pressed my finger against the sensor. The screen lit up. Through barely opened eyes, I watched the light reflect across her face as she worked for nearly 3 minutes. I had to force my entire body to remain relaxed because every part of me wanted to sit up and confront her. When she finished, Natalie placed my hand back on the blanket as if nothing had happened. Before leaving, she leaned down and whispered that there were only a few weeks left, then called me a stubborn, stingy old man. The door closed. I waited nearly another minute before opening my eyes. Then I checked the tablet. A large transfer had just been authenticated using my fingerprint. I photographed the screen and the transaction time, but did not immediately cancel the transfer because I needed proof that Natalie was using my biometric identity while I was supposedly asleep. It was one of the hardest moments of self-control in my life. I had faced plenty of people who wanted my money, but none had ever walked into my bedroom at 2 in the morning and used my own hand to authorize a transaction I had never approved. The next morning, I decided to push my performance even further. When I entered the kitchen, I looked at Natalie and called her Martha. She froze. I pretended to be confused, immediately apologized, and said my mind seemed to be getting worse. Natalie walked over, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said she would arrange another appointment with Dr. Eris. I nodded. From that point on, she became noticeably more careless. Gary also called and told me he had found signs that Natalie was using another device to communicate with whoever was behind the plan. I began watching more carefully, and a few days later, spotted a small phone inside a drawer in her office. It was not the broken phone. It was not the device she used openly either. I did not touch it immediately. I simply remembered where it was and told Gary. He said that if I could gain access for a few minutes, we might be able to copy the data we needed. While I waited for an opportunity, Derek's health continued to deteriorate. One morning, I watched him come down the stairs, holding the railing for support. Natalie immediately handed him a smoothie, and Derek drank most of it, without suspicion. About 40 minutes later, he could barely concentrate. Natalie brought over a stack of papers and told him they were company documents that needed attention. Derek asked what one of them was, but she simply said he had already reviewed it and did not need to read it again. Derek stared at the page, clearly confused, and signed anyway. I recorded the entire scene from a distance. When I later had the chance to glance through some papers left behind, I found company names I had never heard of, transfer instructions, and multiple signatures bearing Derek's name. The picture became clearer. Natalie, and whoever was helping her, were not merely stealing money. They were constructing a paper trail designed to make Derek look like the person who had personally approved illegal transactions if anyone investigated. I began to understand that my son could lose more than his health and his marriage. He could lose his freedom. The following morning, I got up very early and positioned myself where I could see into the kitchen without Natalie noticing. She was preparing 2 green smoothies. After looking around, Natalie opened a small cabinet near the pantry and removed a dark glass bottle, hidden behind several supplement containers. She used a dropper. I watched clearly as she put several drops into Derek's glass and then added a larger amount to mine. Even though I already knew the truth, seeing it happen with my own eyes sent a chill through me. This was no longer suspicion. It was no longer words on a screen. The woman who once called me Dad was standing in the kitchen, calmly poisoning both her husband and her father-in-law. I deliberately made noise as I entered. Natalie startled slightly, but quickly regained her composure and handed me the smoothie, saying it would help clear my mind. I accepted it with a smile. Inside my jacket, I had hidden a small insulated container. When she turned her back, I poured most of the smoothie into it and pretended to finish what remained. Derek came downstairs several minutes later and drank all of his. I watched the effects appear almost on schedule. His eyes became heavy, his speech less clear, and his concentration faded rapidly. Natalie brought documents. Derek signed again. As soon as I could leave the house without raising suspicion, I took the sample to Gary. He sealed it carefully and sent it to a private laboratory through someone he trusted. Then he gave me a small device that could copy data from Natalie's secret phone. I had to wait 3 days for the right opportunity. That evening, Natalie went upstairs to shower, and Derek was already resting in his room. I entered her office, opened the drawer, and found the phone exactly where I had seen it before. I followed every step Gary had taught me, staying calm even though every small sound in the hallway made me think Natalie might return. Within minutes, the copy was complete, and everything was restored to its original position. Gary called me the next day. He had a name, Julian Vance, a former attorney who had lost his license after a financial fraud case. I drove directly to Gary's shop. On the screen were not only Julian's records, but photographs of Natalie and him leaving a hotel, meeting inside a car, and exchanging gestures that could not possibly be explained as business. I looked at those images and thought about Derek. He had lived under the same roof with this woman for years, trusting her completely, while Natalie was not only poisoning him, but having an affair with the very man helping her build the scheme. Yet the affair quickly became the least important discovery. Gary opened the financial messages. Julian had been instructing Natalie to use multiple shell companies to move money out of accounts connected to my family. The transfers were split into smaller amounts, routed through several layers, and many of the documents carried Derek's signature or authorization. If federal investigators followed the paperwork, the trail would lead to my son. Natalie and Julian would take the money. Derek would take the blame. At that point, I could finally see almost the entire structure of their plan. Poison me to create evidence of incompetence. Poison Derek to obtain his signatures. Use those signatures to move money. File for guardianship to gain control of what remained. Then leave Derek standing in the middle of the financial crimes if anyone investigated. This was no longer merely betrayal within a family. It was a plan designed to destroy both father and son. The laboratory results arrived the following morning. Gary called me to the shop and placed an envelope in front of me. According to the report, the smoothie contained a high concentration of benzodiazepine, along with an experimental compound capable of causing cognitive impairment, reducing concentration, and worsening confusion when used over an extended period. I asked whether a person taking those substances regularly could appear to be developing dementia or serious memory problems. Gary said that was exactly what made the situation so dangerous. The symptoms I had experienced for months could easily be interpreted by outsiders as normal age-related cognitive decline. If Natalie combined those symptoms with fabricated medical records, financial transactions I supposedly forgot, and testimony from family members, she could create a very convincing case. I thought about the guardianship petition. Everything fit together. Natalie was not waiting for me to become frail. She was manufacturing a frail version of me with chemicals, then using the symptoms she caused as evidence against me in court. Gary described it as a chemical prison. I understood exactly what he meant. If a person cannot trust his own memory, cannot concentrate long enough to defend himself, and is constantly told by everyone around him that he is losing his mind, he does not need bars around him to lose his freedom. I knew evidence alone would not be enough. I needed someone who could turn what we had into a legal shield before Natalie and Julian completed the plan. The person I called was Sarah Jenkins. Sarah had represented my company for years and handled some of the most complicated disputes Stanton Logistics had ever faced. She was difficult to intimidate, hated meaningless reassurance, and had a habit of looking directly at the problem before saying anything. We met in Sarah's office after business hours, so Natalie would not know I was seeking legal advice. I placed everything on the table: the phone data, photographs of Natalie and Julian, guardianship paperwork, financial transactions, and toxicology results. Sarah read for nearly 40 minutes without saying much. She made notes, marked several pages, and asked me to verify the timing of a few events. When she finished, she said the first thing we needed to do was protect the assets before thinking about arrests. I told her there was still roughly $15 million in assets Natalie might be targeting. Sarah immediately warned me not to move everything impulsively into another account. Because Natalie had already built a case alleging that I lacked capacity, a sudden multi-million-dollar transfer could itself be presented as evidence that I was acting irrationally. Instead, Sarah proposed creating a blind trust with independent control and complete documentation showing that I was mentally competent when the decision was made. Within 2 days, the remaining assets were legally transferred into that structure. Natalie knew nothing. Julian knew nothing. On the surface, nothing seemed different, but the money they believed was within reach had been placed behind a legal door they could not simply open. For a few minutes, I felt relieved. Then I thought about Derek. Money could be protected with documents. My son could not. My first instinct was to take Derek to a hospital immediately and tell him everything. But Sarah had contacted a medical specialist after reviewing the laboratory report. The warning we received forced me to change course. If Derek had been receiving benzodiazepines regularly for an extended period, stopping abruptly could cause a severe and potentially dangerous withdrawal reaction. We could not simply knock the smoothie from his hand and declare that the problem was over. The process had to be controlled. That meant I had to continue living with Natalie, continue pretending to be mentally impaired, and somehow reduce Derek's exposure without allowing her to realize what I was doing. Sarah and the medical specialist helped create a cautious plan. Beginning the next morning, I started substituting Derek's poisoned smoothie with ordinary vegetable juice, while his exposure was carefully reduced under professional guidance. Every breakfast became a small performance. Some mornings, I deliberately spilled coffee so Natalie would leave the kitchen to get towels. Other mornings, I claimed I could not find my glasses and asked her to look upstairs. Once, I pretended to become dizzy so she would turn away to find medication. A few seconds were enough. I switched Derek's drink. Then everything looked normal again. The first days were difficult. Derek trembled more, slept poorly, and became irritable. By the third day, he was sweating heavily, rubbing his hands constantly, and telling Natalie that his body felt strange. I was afraid she would tuss, so I made my own performance worse. I confused the day of the week, left my keys in absurd places, called Natalie Martha again. The more impaired I appeared, the more confident Natalie became that the drugs were still working, and the less attention she paid to Derek's changes. By the 5th day, I could clearly see the difference. My son's eyes were sharper. His speech was more coherent. His concentration was returning. That night, I found Derek sitting alone in the garage. He stared at me for a long time and asked directly whether I had done something to his smoothies over the past few days. I closed the garage door. The moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. I gave Derek the laboratory report first. He read every line and then looked up, his face drained of color, asking where the sample had come from. I told him it came from the smoothie Natalie prepared for us. His first reaction was denial. He said Natalie could not possibly do something like that. I did not argue because I knew a 10-year marriage could not be erased by a statement from his father. Instead, I showed him the photographs of Natalie and Julian. Derek studied each one. Then I showed him the messages, the conversations about the drugs, the signatures, me, him. I watched a 10-year marriage collapse across my son's face in a matter of minutes. But the most painful part was still ahead. I placed the records of the shell companies and financial transactions in front of Derek. There were signatures he remembered. Others he could not remember at all. I explained that if federal authorities investigated, the paperwork had been designed to make Derek look like the person who had personally approved the transactions. Natalie and Julian were not only stealing money, they were preparing for him to take the blame. Derek sat silently for a long time. When he finally spoke, the first thing he did was apologize to me. He remembered all the times I insisted I had never signed certain documents and how he had been the one telling me I must have forgotten. Derek said he had looked at his own father as though I were losing my mind because he had completely trusted Natalie. I placed a hand on my son's shoulder and reminded him that he had been drugged and manipulated just as I had. Derek still said he felt as though he had betrayed me. I told him that if he wanted to feel guilty, we would have plenty of time for that later. Right now, we had to stop Natalie from finishing what she had started. Derek asked what we were going to do. I asked where Natalie expected both of us to go on Friday. After thinking for a moment, he remembered that we were scheduled to visit a lawyer's office to sign the final guardianship documents. I told him we were still going. Derek looked at me as if I had finally lost my mind for real. I explained that if we canceled, Natalie would immediately know something had changed. The best way to keep both her and Julian exactly where we needed them was to continue letting them believe that father and son remained completely under their control. Derek understood. From that night forward, we were allies. The days leading up to Friday were the most tense period of the entire ordeal. Natalie grew more confident with each passing hour. She believed the drugs were still working and began speaking in front of us, as though neither Derek nor I were mentally alert enough to understand what we heard. After breakfast, Derek continued pretending to be sluggish. He spoke less, occasionally repeated questions, and allowed Natalie to believe that his decline was continuing. I also kept playing the part of the confused old man. Although the closer we came to the signing date, the more careful I had to be not to overdo it and accidentally strengthen Natalie's legal case against me. Cesara and Gary worked behind the scenes. Gary finished arranging the data from both phones into a clear timeline. Deleted messages, calls, financial transactions, and photographs were connected to one another so that the pattern became unmistakable. Sara passed the necessary evidence to the authorities. Once the toxicology results, financial documents, and forged signatures were placed together, the case no longer looked like a family dispute. It looked like an organized criminal scheme. On Wednesday night, I heard Natalie speaking on the phone in the living room. She knew I was sitting only a few yards away, but by then she barely seemed to care. I heard her say, "Friday and it's finished," followed by, "Once he signs, there won't be a problem anymore." I did not need to hear the person on the other end to know it was Julian. Her words told me that both of them believed victory was only days away. Derek, meanwhile, was fighting a different battle. He was not yet fully through the withdrawal process, and he still had to live in the same house with the woman he now knew had been poisoning him. Sometimes during dinner, I caught him staring at Natalie for a long time. I knew he was trying to reconcile the woman sitting across from him with the photographs and messages he had seen in the garage. One evening, after Natalie had gone to bed, Derek came into my room. He asked whether I was afraid of Friday. I told him I was. He looked surprised, perhaps because he had spent his entire life assuming I was the kind of man who did not experience fear. I told my son that being fearless was not strength. Understanding danger and keeping your mind clear anyway, that was strength. On Friday, we would walk into a room with two people who had spent months trying to destroy our lives. The only difference was that this time we knew exactly who they were. Derek asked what he should do if Natalie cried. I told him she almost certainly would. He became quiet. I understood why the question mattered. A marriage does not disappear the moment the truth comes out. Derek could be horrified by what Natalie had done and still carry 10 years of memories, attachment, and shared history. I reminded him that tears did not change evidence. He nodded. On Thursday night, Sarah called. She said everything was ready and told us to follow the plan exactly. After the call, I stood by the window and watched Natalie sitting outside with a glass of wine. She was texting someone and occasionally smiling, completely unaware that $15 million had already been placed beyond her reach, that Derek was becoming clear-minded again, and that evidence she believed had been deleted was now in the hands of people who could use it against her. According to Natalie's plan, the next morning Richard Stanton would sign away control of his own life. What she did not know was that the man who would walk into Julian's office was no longer the old man she had been poisoning for months. Friday morning, Natalie wore a cream-colored suit and looked as polished as though she were preparing for an important business meeting. Derek sat in the passenger seat. I sat in the back and deliberately allowed one hand to tremble slightly on my knee. On the way, Natalie explained that we only needed to sign a few papers so the family could help me manage things more effectively. I asked what papers she meant. She smiled and reminded me that we had already discussed it many times. I immediately apologized for forgetting. Through the rearview mirror, I saw satisfaction on Natalie's face. It was the expression of someone who believed the hardest part was already over. Julian's office was located in an unremarkable commercial building in North Austin. There was no large sign, no luxurious reception area. Only tinted glass, gray carpet, and a quiet hallway. Julian came out to greet us with the confidence of a man who believed the plan had already succeeded. This was the first time I had met face-to-face with the person who had helped Natalie poison my family, move money, and prepare Derek to take the blame. I deliberately asked whether we had met before. Julian glanced at Natalie for a second, then smiled and said we had not. He led us into a conference room. A thick stack of documents had already been arranged on the table. Julian explained that everything was very simple and that I only needed to sign at the marked locations. He repeatedly used pleasant words such as support, protection, security, and management. No one mentioned what would actually happen if I signed. I would lose control of my own life. Julian placed a Mont Blanc pen in front of me. I picked it up with a trembling hand. Natalie watched every movement. Derek lowered his head as if he were still under the effects of the drugs. I brought the tip of the pen close to the signature line. Then I stopped. Natalie said my name impatiently when she saw the pen hovering above the signature line. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I slowly allowed my hand to stop trembling and straightened my back. After months of pretending to be weak, returning to my natural posture almost felt unfamiliar. I raised my eyes and looked at Natalie. The satisfaction disappeared from her face. I turned the Mont Blanc between completely steady fingers, then threw it onto the table. The tip struck the edge of the paperwork, splattering black ink across the guardianship documents. I told her clearly that I would not sign anything else for her. Natalie stared at me, as though she had just watched a dead man stand up. She immediately turned toward Julian. He tried to maintain his composure, saying perhaps I was confused and everyone should take a few minutes before continuing. I looked directly at him and called him by his full name, Julian Vance. Then I mentioned that he had lost his law license for financial fraud and asked whether the shell companies he was now using were simply a new version of the same old trick. Julian's expression changed almost instantly. Natalie realized control was slipping away and turned toward Derek. She grabbed her husband's arm, said I was having another episode, and asked him to explain to Julian that incidents like this had been happening for months. Derek kept his head lowered for several seconds. Then he slowly looked up. His eyes were completely clear. Natalie released his arm almost immediately. Derek asked his wife how long she had been putting drugs into his drinks. For a moment, Natalie stood completely still. Then she began denying everything. She claimed I had filled Derek's head with paranoid ideas and used his poor health to turn husband and wife against each other. Derek did not argue. He took out his phone and placed it on the table. The screen showed photographs of Natalie and Julian leaving a hotel, sitting together in a car, and kissing when both of them believed nobody was watching. Natalie stared at the screen and immediately looked away. Derek moved on to the messages, discussing the drugs, conversations saying he did not need to understand anything as long as he signed, and finally, the financial transactions carrying his name. He asked Natalie whether she had truly intended to let him take the blame for everything. That was when she began to cry. Natalie said things were not what Derek believed, and claimed Julian had been the one behind the entire plan. Julian spun toward her, clearly stunned that she had turned on him so quickly. He immediately accused Natalie of being the person who wanted the Stanton family fortune, and said she had been the one who suggested exploiting Derek's condition to obtain signatures. Within less than a minute, the alliance they had spent months building began collapsing in front of us. I had seen similar behavior many times in business. When a scheme succeeds, everyone wants credit. When it collapses, the nearest ally becomes the first sacrifice. Julian realized the argument was getting him nowhere and headed for the door. I calmly told him that was probably not a good idea. He turned around and asked whether I was threatening him. I simply looked toward the door. It opened before I needed to answer. Sarah Jenkins walked into the room. Federal agents followed her. Natalie became completely still. I watched the exact moment she understood that this was no longer a family argument she could manage with tears, lies, or fabricated medical records. The agents instruct everyone to step away from the table and began carrying out their procedures. Phones, computers, and documents in Julian's office were seized while Sarah stood beside me and reminded me that I did not need to say anything more. Julian quickly requested an attorney. Natalie reacted very differently. She turned toward Derek, called his name repeatedly, and insisted that she still loved him. She claimed Julian had manipulated her, pressured her, and allowed everything to spiral beyond her control. Derek stared at the woman with whom he had shared 10 years of his life. He asked how she could stand in the kitchen every morning, watch her husband drink that substance, and then continue her day as though nothing had happened. Natalie said the dosage had never been dangerous. Derek asked whether she had ever considered that he might die. She said no. Then, he asked whether she had ever considered that his father might die. This time, Natalie did not answer. Her silence gave him the clearest answer possible. As the agents prepared to remove her from the room, Natalie tried to use the final thing still connecting them. She reminded Derek that she was his wife and begged him not to let other people destroy their marriage. Derek looked at her for a long time. I knew he was not merely looking at the woman standing in front of him. He was looking back across 10 years of his life, their wedding, vacations, ordinary mornings, and every shared memory that was now clouded by doubt. Finally, Derek told her that the woman he had married died for him. The moment she decided to put poison into his family's drinks, Natalie had nothing left to say. The agents escorted her away. Julian followed. When the conference room door closed, Derek sat down and his hands began to shake. This time, it was not because of drugs. He was shaking because the entire truth had finally become real. I sat beside my son without trying to offer some sentence that would magically make everything better. Some wounds cannot be softened with words, and betrayal by the person you trusted most is one of them. 3 months later, Natalie and Julian remained in custody, awaiting trial without bail. The investigation had expanded to multiple shell companies and millions of dollars in transactions. While the phone records, toxicology evidence, and financial documents destroyed the story that Richard Stanton was simply a confused old man losing his mind. Sarah helped restore my name and authority over the assets that had been compromised, and dealt with the fraudulent powers of attorney. Banking access was changed, and the blind trust continued, protecting the remaining assets from anyone who had tried to reach them. I also had everything belonging to Natalie removed from the Westlake Hills house. Her clothes, photographs, decorations, and supplement containers were taken away. I specifically ordered the cabinet where she had hidden the dark glass bottle to be removed completely. I did not want to walk into the kitchen every morning and see the place where the poison had once been stored. Derek needed longer to recover. His body gradually became stronger, his weight returned, and his concentration improved. But the hardest damage was not physical. He had to accept that the woman he trusted most had poisoned him, betrayed him, and planned to turn him into the fall guy for financial crimes he could barely remember helping commit. As the weeks passed, I slowly began to see my son return. His eyes became brighter, his voice steadier, and one morning I watched Derek walk into the company office with the posture of the man I remembered before. All of this began. Another morning, the two of us sat in the same kitchen where Natalie had once prepared those green smoothies. There was no kale, no supplement bottles, no dark glass containers hidden in the pantry. Only 2 cups of black coffee sat in front of us. Derek looked at mine and asked whether I was ever going to drink another smoothie again. I told him he had guessed correctly. For the first time in a long while, we both laughed about something that had nothing to do with lawyers, drugs, or stolen transactions. After a while, Derek said the thing that frightened him most was not Natalie stealing money or having an affair. It was the fact that she had made him believe everything happening around him was normal. He had believed his exhaustion was stress. He had believed the gaps in my memory were simply old age. He had even believed that his own father had signed documents I repeatedly insisted I had never seen. I told him that was the most dangerous part of Natalie's entire plan. She had not started by trying to steal $15 million overnight. She started with lies small enough that nobody reacted to them, then used each lie as the foundation for the next, until both father and son began doubting their own memories. A doctor's appointment that never existed became proof I had forgotten. A forged signature became proof I could not remember signing. A tremor caused by chemicals became evidence of age-related decline. Derek's exhaustion became an excuse for Natalie to take control of more and more decisions. If her phone had not fallen onto the marble floor that Tuesday morning, I do not know where the story would have ended. Perhaps only weeks later, I would have been placed in a care facility under a court order declaring that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. Derek might have been investigated for transactions he could not even remember signing. Natalie and Julian had calculated almost everything. But they made one mistake. They believed age had turned me into a different man. I was 70 years old, and I certainly was no longer the 40-year-old who could work 16-hour days without slowing down. Sometimes I needed a few extra seconds to remember a name, my knees no longer enjoyed staircases, and one day I might genuinely need someone else's help. But needing help does not mean being weak. Growing older does not mean losing the ability to think. Natalie looked at my gray hair, trembling hands, and moments of silence, and assumed the man who had built a logistics empire from nothing had disappeared. She forgot those same hands had signed contracts that saved my company from bankruptcy. And the mind she was trying to cloud had survived nearly 50 years of business warfare. Her greatest was seeing my silence and interpreting it as helplessness. Derek lifted his cup of coffee and thanked me for not leaving him behind. I told him he was my son, so there was nothing to thank me for. Our cups touched gently. 3 months earlier, we had sat in that same kitchen drinking green liquid we believed was good for us, while a woman standing only a few feet away was quietly destroying both of our minds. Now there was only black coffee in front of us, hot, bitter, and completely untouched by anything else. If nearly 50 years in business taught me one thing, it is that the most dangerous person does not always arrive with an obvious threat. Sometimes they smile, call themselves family, and insist that everything they do is only because they want to take care of you. And sometimes, the only way to defeat someone like that is to let them continue believing you have noticed nothing and they walk too far into the trap they created for themselves. So if there is one thing I want anyone hearing this story to remember, it is this: never mistake silence for ignorance, and never assume that old age means weakness. Natalie made both mistakes. By the time she realized the old man she had been poisoning for months was still completely aware, had seen every move, and had quietly prepared his counterattack, every exit had already closed. And by then, it was far too late.